good to go.
Okay, welcome. I'm Gray Reed, and I've been working with Martha Schoolman on an exhibition of the Humanities Action Lab work from around the country. This exhibition is on display at the FIU library here. And tonight we have one of the participants from that exhibition who's going to, actually three, who are going to talk about oral history, revolutionary listening. So I'd like to introduce Ricia Chansky. There she is, Ricia Chansky. She's a full professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayaguez. She holds a doctorate from the Illinois State University. But I think the most important thing about Ricia is that she came into a situation in Puerto Rico, starting off teaching, okay, good. Suddenly we have Hurricane Maria. What now? And so Ricia really stepped to the front lines and developed a program with her students to go out into the community to talk with their neighbors about their experiences in the hurricane. And we have two of those students with us tonight, Aleyshka Estevez and Natalia Betancourt, who you will hear from. But their work was collected into a lovely oral history book, Mia Maria, which was recently published by Haymarket Press. So they're really the voices of people's resilience, people's response to disaster. And she's here to talk with us tonight about the role of oral history in response to disaster. So is that fair enough?
Thank you, Gray.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. I hope you are all doing well this evening. I was just saying to my friends and colleagues who are here tonight that I'm pretty used to giving Zoom talks after 2 years of COVID, but I'm not used to actual humans in the room with me. So if I start over talking or giggling madly, please excuse me. I wanted to say thank you very much to both Gray and Martha Schoolman, who are two colleagues that I've worked with for a few years in the Humanities Action Lab, who are kind and generous people and went adventuring with us in Puerto Rico. And I'm grateful to them for hosting me here today and their colleagues at FIU. I want to say that tonight we're going to be talking about oral histories, and we're going to be sharing some narratives or excerpts from narratives. And I just want to be upfront to say that these are narratives about disaster and survival, and they're about being co-participants in a communal trauma. And that means that there will be some heavy narratives that we're sharing this evening. And typically at this point in a Zoom lecture, I would say, I completely understand if you need to turn off your camera and step away for a moment. So I say that to the folks on Zoom, but then to the folks in the room, I say also, please don't worry if you need to step outside. We understand that some of the conversation that we're having this evening is definitely on the heavy side. Hurricane Maria made landfall in the Puerto Rican archipelago on September 20, 2017, leaving no part of Puerto Rico unscathed. And I'm working on a computer that's not mine, so please give me a second to advance the slide. There we go. The hurricane triggered floods and mudslides. It washed out roads, destroying tens of thousands of homes, farms, and businesses. It caused the largest blackout in US history and the second largest in the world. It knocked out communications, led to widespread shortages in food, drinking water, and gasoline, and was ultimately responsible for thousands of deaths. When classes at the University of Puerto Rico, at Mayaguez, where we are all from this evening, resumed just over a month later, we returned to campus knowing that it was one of the only places on the west coast of Puerto Rico that had somewhat stable electricity and running water. The university became a haven for our students and our community. But we learned quickly that many students who had restarted their semesters were in precarious positions because of what they had lost in the storm. University administrators encouraged faculty to ask about the post-hurricane material conditions of our students so that we could direct them to whatever relief services were available, and we hurriedly reshaped our classrooms to meet students' new needs. I added a voluntary, ungraded hurricane memoir assignment to the official questionnaire, asking students to share in writing anything that they wanted about their experiences in the storm. The intent was to give them a way to voice their recollections and lighten their loads while transitioning back into the work of the classroom. Every student filled notebook pages with handwritten accounts of the hurricane and its aftermath. And as I read their words by candlelight, it would still be months before electricity was returned to our homes. The desire grew to begin a project that would amplify stories of the hurricane in the hopes of generating immediate relief and building long-term change. Students wrote about the doors and windows of their family homes bursting open, watching helplessly as wind and rain destroyed their possessions. One student, Gabriel, wrote about how he and his grandmother held on to each other for hours, rocking back and forth and weeping together as the storm peeled off their roof and their belongings whirled around them. There were stories about rivers overflowing their banks and storm surges of ocean water pouring through houses with 3, 9, and even 11 feet of floodwaters and stinking mud filling homes. Others wrote about seeing the animals on their farms drowned and crops ruined, businesses destroyed, about empty grocery stores and the search for drinking water. Towns that look like post-apocalyptic movie sets after the bomb went off. The words screaming and crying were repeated again and again. Eventually, I came to Alejandra's memoir, in which she describes sitting helplessly on her porch as she watched her neighbors bury 2 of their family members in their backyard. The saddest thing, she wrote, was to see our neighbors digging graves in their backyards because relatives had passed away due to the lack of medical attention in Aguadilla, since the only hospital there had to be shut down and the electricity remained off. Her neighbors had been unable to receive their routine medical care and died because of it. Reading this narrative, catching a glimpse of what Alejandra carried with her every day, made me want to do more to alleviate that burden. This was the moment of commitment to a project that would gather stories of surviving Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, one that would assemble individual voices as part of a polyphonic narrative of disaster with the intent of making real change for us and others who have survived natural and human-made disasters. In August 2018, less than a year after the hurricane made landfall, we met this objective with the inception of the Mi Maria project in collaboration with Voice of Witness. I was quickly joined by colleagues, and together we offered 4 courses in which we trained approximately 100 undergraduate students from all majors and disciplines at the university in the ethical recording, transcription, translation, and initial stages of editing oral histories. All of these students are survivors of Hurricane Maria, each with their own story to tell, who went into their home communities to collect unheard stories of the hurricane and its aftermath. It is important for us to recognize that at the time this course began, the narrative surrounding the catastrophic hurricane was being heavily shaped by the US federal government. Then President Donald Trump visited Puerto Rico 2 weeks after Maria made landfall, threw paper towels out into the crowd, congratulated himself on an excellent relief effort, joked that Hurricane Maria would throw the federal budget out of whack, and suggested that Maria was not a, quote, real catastrophe in comparison to Hurricane Katrina. These actions set the tone for much of the official news related to the aftermath and certainly impacted the amount and type of relief that reached the archipelago. It was therefore extremely important that students collaborating on this mass listening project were afforded as much agency as possible to shape their contributions in the ways that were most important to them and their lived experiences. With these factors in mind, I designed the courses using an umbrella model in which I constructed the theoretical, thematic, and practical framework of the project, as well as provided training in oral history, recording, transcription, and translation according to the best practices of the Oral History Association, while modeling aspects of the trauma-informed approach developed by Voice of Witness. This instruction was augmented by lessons developed in accord with oral historians throughout the Caribbean who have developed anti-racist and decolonial methodologies and applications for life stories in and about the archipelago. Within this framework, each student mapped out their own part of the project, selecting the social justice issue, narrator, municipality, and intended audience that was of specific interest to them as survivors of the hurricane. And tomorrow, if you're able to attend the workshop that we're giving, the workshop will be focused on how to develop umbrella models in a couple of different scenarios for decolonial practice in oral history and social justice projects. The first third of the semester was dedicated to the study of oral history as a methodology, particularly well suited to the social justice and climate justice needed in the long aftermath of the hurricane, especially as those needs are situated in an unjust colonial context that positions the people of Puerto Rico as second-class citizens. After the initial training in oral history theory and practice, including studying oral histories as literary text, students proposed and developed their own oral history interviews with consideration of the people and issues that were the most interest to them within the framework of a polyphonic narrative of national and natural disaster. Students conferred with me about their proposals and received significant feedback prior to conducting interviews. Once the interviews were completed, the remainder of the course was taught workshop style. Students, in collaboration with each other and me, worked on transcription, translation, and initial editing of their narratives within the space of the classroom. In that way, we could together work through questions such as what words should be translated into English, what words should remain in Spanish with a footnote, or remain in Spanish without a footnote. Several mini presentations, both formal and informal, occurred during that time period in which students shared elements of their oral histories or part of the process in which they were engaged. This happened formally at midterm times and informally throughout the semester. Students participating in this project recorded stories from people such as Nilda Rodriguez Collazo, who describes her adrenaline as rising to 1,000,000 when her neighbor burst into her home to warn of a rising storm surge at his heels. Luis G. Flores Lopez, who watches his father get sicker and sicker as they desperately pray for the dialysis clinic to reopen so that he can receive life-saving treatment. And Miliana Ivalis Montañez León, whose mother is sent home from the hospital with her condition undiagnosed, only to die in her own bedroom. In her testimonial, Miliana recounts that her mother said that her mother looked at me with terrified eyes. She was saying, "I can't breathe. Help me. Ayúdame." My dad was on the phone and he said, 911 isn't working. The call isn't connecting. Over 2 months after Maria, telecommunications were still poor. My dad went out into the street to try to get a signal. I held my mom and kissed her forehead. Suddenly, she said, "I'm seeing little stars." She took a deep breath and then she was gone. It was the most chaotic time. A person is dying in front of you and you can't do something as basic as connect to the emergency number. The second course in this sequence used oral histories that were recorded in the previous semester, such as Miliana's, as primary text for students to conduct community-based service learning projects that culminated in public-facing projects such as exhibition, archiving, events, and other forms of narrative dissemination. Students self-selected small groups in which to work collaboratively, and each group selected their own topic, some based upon their majors or areas of interest, and some by browsing the collected oral histories first. While the parameters were quite flexible, each group began by analyzing an oral history narrative and then designing a community-based research project that connected their work to active learning with a mutual aid organization, citizen scientist program, or other established charitable institution. An additional 50 students enrolled in this semester of the project, and there were approximately 10 teams, each with their own community partner and mentor who had prior experience in the area of study. One example of the types of group projects completed by students in this course comes from a team focusing on the lack of potable water after the hurricane. They selected an oral history recounted by Vivian Miranda Rodriguez as their primary text. In the narrative, Vivian describes drinking from a nearby stream when her family could not find any other fresh water source after the hurricane, and how her two young sons, Inti, age 10, and Anouk, age 8, were diagnosed with severe dysentery from drinking unclean water with fecal matter in it. And I just ruined everything.
They can't see it.
They can't see it. There we go. Thank you very much. As I said, I'm not quite fit for being in public yet. Please excuse me. In her narrative, she explains that she and her husband had wanted to keep Inti and Anouk here in Puerto Rico with us. But then the boys, my sister, and I got sick from the water. We had abdominal pain, fever, diarrhea, and headaches. With no running water at our house, we were going to natural springs and filtering the water. But just because it's a natural spring doesn't mean it's crystal clean. Everybody was going to the springs, but a lot of people were getting really sick. Finally, we decided the boys should go to the States. On October 15, we ended up going to San Juan to fly the boys out. I have never seen the airport so packed. It was chaotic. Wall-to-wall people with baggage like they were never coming back. This was a mass exodus. Oops. Okay. The potable water team spent days doing field research with the Blue Water Task Force of Fundación Surfrider de Rincón to study how Surfrider adapted their seawater testing program to freshwater sources in the mountainous interior of Puerto Rico. Oftentimes hiking and backpacking into communities in which access roads had washed out during the hurricane. This is a picture of our team who started by analyzing the oral history narrative of Vivian, working with Steve Tamar, who is the leader of the Blue Water Task Force in Puerto Rico. And here, you can see the team at the Ultimo Brinco waterfall putting the system into practice at a freshwater site. So the Blue Water Task Force has for years been testing the water on the coast to study coral reef health. And then after the hurricane, when the freshwater sources were poisoning people, the government asked them to take their water testing program and move into the interior into some of the freshwater sources that people were using. This is a site in which families retrieve drinking water. And here is the lab results from the water that they collected. The glowing part reflects fecal coliform bacteria and other extremely harmful elements in the water. This team ultimately created a short film about the process, beginning with Vivian's oral history narrative, chronicling their work with the Blue Water Task Force, and then going to other mutual aid groups and citizen scientist groups that were studying freshwater sources at that time. This is just a very short overview of the approximately 100 oral history narratives that we collected in that first year of the project, the year after Hurricane Maria made landfall in the archipelago. This program was up and running less than 1 year after the devastation of Hurricane Maria. And it's a brief introduction to the community-based projects that use some of these oral histories as a foundation for collaboration with mutual aid and citizen scientist groups across the Puerto Rican archipelago that provided active learning opportunities for students who are also survivors and co-participants in the communal trauma of Hurricane Maria. These examples are offered both as a sampling of the types of stories that we recorded and as a means of demonstrating individual and pedagogical aspects of mass listening projects that stand to memorialize disaster as a means of witnessing communal trauma. Selections from our collected narratives may be found in the volume Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, and in the beautiful exhibition from the Humanities Action Lab, Climates of Inequality, which is outside of this room in the library. You know that it's a bilingual traveling exhibition. And so this is the cover of our book, and this is what the exhibition looked like when it was in Rutgers. In the almost 500 oral histories that we have recorded since the project began, I have mapped out the overarching theme of community response to climate disaster. And so what we're looking at is when government-based relief, both on the federal level and on local levels, had widespread failures. How did members of communities stand up and help each other? But within that, we have found 4 patterns across the narratives: lack of potable water, food insecurity, homelessness and houselessness, and insufficient medical and mental health care. In our current project, our current phase of the project, which we have titled Sheltered in Place, we are exploring the intersections of surviving the public health crisis of the global pandemic of COVID-19 while still in the long aftermath of Hurricane Maria. In this phase of the project, we've really decided to focus on food insecurity, and one of the things that we're really interested in is how did mutual aid organizations to feed people after Hurricane Maria adapt to the new needs of the COVID crisis when we needed to physically distance from each other. So we're interested in how do people care for each other in the aftermath of disaster? How is food involved in that caretaking? In what ways were active caring for each other formalized into mutual aid groups in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, even if that formalization was nominal, even if it was a group of folks meeting in one person's living room every so often? And then how did the mutual aid organizations adapt to the new needs presented within the global pandemic of COVID-19? These are some of the research questions guiding this stage of the project. And while we're working with several people, mutual aid groups, and citizen scientist organizations across the Puerto Rican archipelago, one of our main partners is COLEGIAL. COLEGIAL is an on-campus food aid program begun by Lucy Serrano Colon. And that organization currently feeds over 1,000 students, a number that grew tenfold after Hurricane Maria. The organization now has a student board of directors, almost 100 volunteers, regular donation partners, and hubs on several other campuses of the UPR system. In our study of COLEGIAL, we are particularly interested in the foodways of the Puerto Rican archipelago, where indigenous, Afro-diasporic, and European foods and food traditions meet. How were these unique foods and food traditions adapted to serve communities after disaster? And how were they further adapted to serve the new needs of a global pandemic in which people were forced to maintain physical distance from each other? Our study includes the importation, production, growing, preparing, and distributing of food during disaster, especially stratified disasters, which include in the Puerto Rican archipelago, hurricanes, earthquakes, the pandemic, economic depression, and colonial contexts. Aleyshka and Natalia, who are joining me here today, are both graduate student collaborators on the Sheltered in Place project, who have participated in interviews with Lucy Serrano Gaston of COLEGIAL, and they will now discuss aspects of the interviews that are of particular interest to the project and touch upon their experiences conducting both the oral history interviews and participating in a documentary film that we are currently making on food insecurity in the Puerto Rican archipelago. I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna go this way.
So hello everyone, my name is Natalia Betancourt and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Lucy and what we learned from her in our interviews. So on our first interview with Lucy, we discussed her background with food, particularly how her relationship with food began. She described how preparing a meal in her home was a family effort, meaning everyone had to participate one way or another. I want to discuss her experience in making a traditional Puerto Rican Christmas dinner because it is a tradition that is upheld in almost every family throughout the archipelago. So as Lucy says, every Christmas her family would kill a pig and use every part of it to prepare a Christmas dinner. That pig is used to make pasteles, morcilla, and even as a child, Lucy knew the process of how to make them. She found the entire ordeal of making morcillas a little grotesque and explained how traumatizing and difficult it was for her to listen to the pig being killed, having to clean the entrails and blowing the tripa or the guts to remove all the blood and all of the feces out of it. She couldn't eat the morcilla afterwards because she could remember the process and be disgusted by it. She later made up excuses as she grew up to get out of the house and sort of get maybe hojas that they would use to hide the tripas inside. Thankfully, however, the tradition continues. You know, years later, her niece Dariana took to the tradition and would happily make the morcillas. Now, Lucy's elderly father can't raise and kill a pig, but they do pay someone else to raise it and kill it for them so that the tradition can continue in their household. This process takes about a year, which is why for us it's a Christmas tradition. And so pasteles, morcilla, and lechon asado are just some of the dishes that can be made from a pig for multiple meals. So this is a good example of how a tradition itself can be that began as a measure to ensure food security. Pasteles, while a staple of Puerto Rican cuisine, are not made in every household because of the complicated cooking process. They are often bought by the dozen from friends or somebody who knows somebody. And for us, that somebody is Maria, Lucy's mom. Maria began making and selling pasteles at a young age as a supporting source of income for her family. She learned from her mother-in-law and continues to keep that tradition alive in her home. She learned from her mother-in-law and continues to keep that tradition alive. When Maria told us her story, she explained how she got the ingredients, plátanos in particular, from friends and neighbors who would donate their produce to her. In return, she would give them a sort of blessed dozen, which just means that they had more than a 12 count in them as a special thank you for their gift to her. So I love her story because it is a beautiful example of how mutual aid functions naturally within communities, as well as how we can see Puerto Rican women use food and domestic labor to further support their family and ensure economic stability. So I would also like to talk about the aguinaldo. So aguinaldo is about making food and sharing food. So on the topic of tradition, Lucy mentions el aguinaldo, which is a big tradition for Maria, her mother, and she does it every year around the same time. Almojábanas, dulce de coco, arroz con leche are placed on a plate and covered in foil. And that was Maria's usual aguinaldo to her neighbors. Our conversation with Maria, she explains the process of her aguinaldos. Every year on Christmas, she would make sweets and fried treats for her neighbors to enjoy. It became such an important tradition that she would not even have to offer it to her neighbors anymore. She would just make them available in plates around her home, and people would just show up and take them as they wanted them or needed them. Lucy, however, is a lot less traditional with this and a lot more selective. She does it whenever she feels up to it during the year, and for special people. That being said, Lucy is well known around the university by her official brand of Negra Latin cuisine, and everyone who has tasted her food is always in the mood for more. I love the idea of the aguinaldo because it details how we can use food to care for and support one's community simply by sharing what we have.
Thank you, Natalia. And in sharing Lucy's legacy through these interviews, we are ensuring that people can get to read about the methods that she uses and the community that she's building, especially through the organization that she built, COLEGIAL. So COLEGIAL began in 2014 when a student, Fabiola Medina, reaches out to Lucy because they share the same values, right? They want to feed their community, which immediately is the University of UPRM. And so I'm using these quotes from an interview conducted in March 2022. This interview was conducted by my colleagues who are not currently here, Gabrielle Armstrong and Yarelis Marcial. And so they met with Lucy and they talked about the developing COLEGIAL from its roots into the expansion and sort of what things Lucy had to manage when building this community organization. And so this first quote here, the first event prepared around 2 weeks of establishing ourselves as an association. We went out in mass. We sent out a mass email to meet in La Placita de Chardon, and people began coming in all with different stories about their food insecurity. The first semester, we reached 100 students. So a little bit about what we can get from Lucy's story is just the methods that she has to use within her university, right? So if she wants to establish something to give aid to students, she has to sign up an association formally with the institution. What sorts of communications can she use to promote events, right? How can students, what is the best way that students can learn? Oh, you can come here and get food. Well, in our university, that is the mass emails. Everyone gets that. So everyone can learn. If you're here at 10 p.m., you can get food. You can, right, receive this that we're giving. And then, of course, that first activity only reached 100 students, but the project keeps expanding. And right now, as Professor Chansky mentioned, it reaches about 1,000 students. And throughout its lifespan, COLEGIAL has fed over 14,000 students. And that number was collected, I think, in 2021. So it should have grown quite a bit. So 14,000 students that have been fed by COLEGIAL. And so how does Lucy handle a project of this size and keeps it sustainable? In her narrative, and especially in this interview conducted this March, we learn about donations and how to move from only perishable, non-perishable items, so cans of soup and things like that. And how do we move from things like that to homemade meals, right? Because Lucy's legacy is about these traditional dishes, about giving people warm food. And so in this case, COLEGIAL moves from just giving cans and just giving non-perishable items to people to expanding to hot meals, hot breakfasts, hot lunches that they are able to give to. And how do they do this? Well, Lucy shares with us her methods, which are diverse. She goes from being able to reach out to community chef that can cook the meals to even preparing students, right? Her student collaborators, which she has hundreds of, to taking them to food handling courses where they can learn safe food handling and can give the food to the students when they arrive, which is especially important when we're dealing with a global pandemic. And, you know, we want to be able to feed people, but also keep them safe when doing it. And so we are observing other needs that align, not just food. And in this way, Come Colegial expands into achieving a lot of other needs, not just food and security. And one of these ways is expanding the project. And so after Maria Lucy shares with us how a student from el recinto de Ciencias Médicas, I have this quote right here. We talked to people in other UPR campuses. Someone from Ciencias Médicas reached out to us because they wanted to bring their project to their campus. So we see that mutual aid is also expanding into, oh, I'm looking at this person having this organization and I want to bring that to my home community. So we're in Mayaguez with Come Colegial, but then San Juan is able to get a Come, what is the name, Come León? And then Ponce is able to get their own Come program. Aguadilla is able to get Come Tiburón. And so now there's 10 Come programs around Puerto Rico, thanks to Lucy being able to share her methods, thanks to her building a sustainable model that other UPR systems can follow, and hopefully other universities as well, and hopefully other organizations around our communities. And so Lucy also becomes a mentor for people. She is directing a large group of students into being able to do this project with her, into being able to be leaders of their own communities, and being able to take this model, take these methods, and serve their own communities wherever they are in their lives. And it's not just with food security. Lucy also, and this is something that my colleagues wanted me to share, is a brilliant person that helps people with housing and other needs, because as Come Colegial's model says, a brain cannot be fed, right, if you're hungry. And you can look that in the Come Colegial website in the UPRM. And it's a model that is based on, we need to be able to fulfill people's basic needs in order for them to be able to live and be successful and live their lives. And this is what Lucy's story teaches us. I don't, yeah, next slide. Thank you. And I'll leave you now with Dr. Chansky to talk about the oral history lab.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your help. Thank you to both Natalia and Aleyshka. As you can see, I have quite a great student team at UPR. I wanted to briefly touch upon where we are right now. I was just talking to one of your colleagues from FIU and saying, you know, most days I'm slightly underwater, but every once in a while I get to step back and pull my head up above water for a second and say, where the heck are we and what the heck are we doing? I think that's the nature of working in disaster studies, that there's always something urgent that you have to attend to, so you don't often take a pause to reflect. But after the Mi Maria project and the shelter in place project that we're working on right now, we applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to begin an oral history action lab on campus. And that's where we are right now. We're waist deep in the middle of that project and starting that oral history lab. That oral history lab is a program that has both a physical space in our library. It brings together three assets from our campuses, the English department, the general library, and the film studies program. And so the physical space in the library has editing stations. Documentary filmmaking is a part of the project, so we have editing stations there. And then we have an interview room. We found out pretty quickly, or I found out pretty quickly, that the places where I was interviewing folks weren't always the greatest in terms of sound quality and quiet, etc. So we're very happy about that. We also have a pretty significant digital factor to that project, and that's something that we're trying to think through, the ethics of high tech, no tech, and low tech integration, especially for the communities that we're working with. And then what we're also starting to process is how do we create a program for oral history for social and climate justice that's rooted in decolonial and anti-racist methodologies while also being trauma-informed. So we're working on a certificate program and then a standalone program for museums, libraries, mutual aid groups, etc. So that's where we are with the program now. And I just wanted to leave you with a couple thoughts about oral history and what does oral history do for us in the aftermath of disaster. Oral history cannot be all things to all people. I realize that. However, oral history can be many things for many people. In our ongoing work in oral history, we have observed and documented that oral history projects are exciting undertakings because this genre is rife with possibility, offering multiple entry points for different communities, departments, and disciplines. Narrative transactions such as those conducted through oral history can resituate those disempowered by disaster and tragedy through the act of storytelling in which the narrator is positioned as the agental protagonist, an act more and more relevant in the face of our ever-growing list of shared cultural traumas. Edited oral histories may be read as creative nonfiction, functioning as literature and a means of stimulating a reading witness to an empathetic and active response to the issues raised in the narrative. Widely disseminated narratives from marginalized communities also have the potential to reshape the national imaginary and resituate underrepresented, silenced voices both within Puerto Rico and the broader US consciousness. Oral history is furthermore an opportunity to craft a polyphonic people's history of experience. Such a record memorializes but accessible digital archives of life stories also stand to build community through connectivity while situating historical documentation as an immediate resource for researchers from numerous fields, thereby allowing these narratives to inform multiple practical and theoretical projects. Data visualization techniques such as interactive geospatial mapping allow scientists, policymakers, and others to utilize community-based data sets, thereby crafting informed and relevant responses to disaster preparation and mitigation. These benefits are in addition to the pedagogical opportunities created for students to engage in active learning projects that stem from classroom community partnership connected to their home communities while fostering bilingual, oral, written, and digital aspects of projects that have clear and relevant purposes. These projects also demonstrate the significance of socio-humanistic research methodologies to their majors and careers. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, multiple scientists working to end the contemporary climate emergency report that there is a problem with humanizing and making relevant the crisis to individuals not currently experiencing the direct responses and repercussions of climatological disaster. This worry is accompanied by acknowledgements that the issues of the Anthropocene era can seem too large and convoluted to find traction with the public. Life stories have the potential to overcome these concerns by providing personalized entry points into larger issues that can seem too remote or too complicated with which to engage. In short, wide dissemination of life stories has the potential to save lives. Thank you all very much. So that is the overview of our project. We tried to be concise. It's hard for me to be concise. I love to dork out and talk about the project, but I think we have some question time. If anybody has, do you want me to do something?